Today, on Here is the Horror.
Rescue 7, come in. This is dispatch. Do you copy over?
Come in, dispatch. Send more paramedics.
Hello, and welcome to Here is the Horror. This is our initial or inaugural episode of our horror podcast, where we initially rise from the dead before the sequel ruins it. I'm Adam. I'll be, co-host, I guess, with my friend Daniel here.
Hello, Daniel here. As always, with my good friend Adam.
Right. And this podcast is, I know there's quite a number of horror podcasts out there, actually, but I know when I personally went digging around hunting for them, maybe you've had better luck with this than me, Daniel, but I know I had a hard time finding any that were really as widespread and covering everything as I wanted them to be. I feel like every one I found was usually very niche. So that's why I started wanting to make this podcast, and also just because I've always been a big fan of horror, but I feel like as time goes on, I've sort of drifted away from it a little bit, and I've been wanting to dig back into it, and this show sort of gives me an avenue to get around to that.
I can understand that. I can relate. Most horror podcasts, they tend to be very, like you said, they're very niche. They generally have a flavor or formula they follow where they focus on one main component of a film, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like you, I kind of wanted to do something that was, a full exploration of all the little nooks and crannies of horror.
Basic format for this show, I guess we should go over that. We'll open each episode with a bit of rough and tumble like we're doing right now, and then go into a sort of current events segment where we just talk about what we've been engaging with in the horror medium lately. And as I said, that is going to be covering the whole gamut of everything horror, not just horror movies, although I'm sure that will be a large chunk of it, but also horror literature, horror games. I know you and I play a fair number of horror board games too, so something like that might even come into it at some point. I would really like to do some haunted house reviews and things like that too, but I guess
you picked the wrong year.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe next time. I don't know. Maybe they'll open them up and just all the monsters have to stay 6 feet away from you, or they just won't have any actors this year. It's just set only. Well. Anyways, following current events, we'll launch into our main topic for each episode. This episode doesn't have too much of a main topic, so the format's going to be a little loose. I suppose this episode's really just about who we are, why we're doing this, what's our horror pedigree, what are we into, and where did we come from. Most episodes will have something a little more specialized, which can also be pretty varied, be it an episode specifically about a franchise, like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, or an episode specifically about a type of monster and how it developed and changed over time and was used in different movies, like vampires, werewolves, zombies, and we could also do more focused on individual contributors to the horror genre, such as individual actors or writers, directors. It's a pretty bottomless well of things that we can have for source material, but I look forward to covering all of it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Following that, we'll have a little bit of upcoming news and events in horror, just anything that we're looking forward to, not so much the latest tabloid news about what's going on with people in the scene. All right, but all that said, because it is our first episode, I feel like it's probably best if we go ahead and switch around the order of events and instead talk a little bit about ourselves before we get into what we've been engaging with recently. So, I can start on that, or Daniel, would you be interested in starting on that? Because while I have been engaged in horror stuff from pretty much as long as I can remember, I remember pretty quickly when you and I became friends back in, I don't even want to think about how long ago it is now.
Oh yeah, I definitely take some of the credit there.
Yeah, I remember you always seemed way more into horror than me back then, and probably kept me on that path for a pretty long time, and maybe that's why now that I'm wanting to do this, I wanted to cooperate with you on this again and get back into that horror. So I don't know if I've ever even really talked to you about it that much. How did you initially get into horror?
Okay. It's pretty complex, really. There was a lot of factors that went into me becoming the horror fan I am. The most significant thing, I think, trace it back to I was probably 7 or 8 years old, so we're talking 1990, 1991. My father was always really into horror for as long as I can remember. Growing up in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, he was really into Hammer horror. That was always a big thing. He always... Anytime there was a horror movie, not even just Hammer, Universal Studios, anything like that, anything that was black and white or very early Technicolor that came on at 11:30, 2 a.m. on a Friday or Saturday night, we were watching. Stuff like 1959's The Mummy, the Hammer horror film. That's probably one of the earliest horror films I can remember watching with my father. And the concept of a mummy is like extremely ridiculous to me today.
I mean, yeah, I've heard some people talk about it and about how these days, like, the idea of just taking like a
shuffling TP'd corpse.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I'm sure a lot of people would say it's really similar to just a zombie, but really, it's just the only difference is it's just a zombie specifically using like the burial rites of a very specific culture.
Well, and you get into the other aspects too, like in something like Monster Squad, for example, the mummy in that is literally just a corpse that shuffles around. But you look at the Hammer films and the Universal Studios mummy films, they have the curses around them too. So it's not just the mummy is kind of like this metaphor for a creeping death, because at the point in these films, there's already so many other people that have died that your main cast knows that it's coming. But there's all these external situations, like there's plagues and sicknesses and you know, things like that come with breaking into the tomb. But as a child, Hammer Horror's The Mummy scared the piss out of me. There was a scene I remember as a child where he's carrying a girl into a swamp and these guys are just shooting the hell out of him. And he just kind of, preemptively pulled a Jason Voorhees. He's getting shot to hell and back, and he just keeps marching. And just something about the way he moved, it just terrified the hell out of me. But he was also, too, and it was probably a little bit age inappropriate for me. Because like I said, these formative memories come from, anywhere from 7 to 10. But he was into anything that was like hypersexual, things like From Beyond, Castle Freak, any kind of film that had overtly sexual overtones. Hellraiser, he was very into those films as well. Faces of Death, I watched that at an age where it was grotesquely inappropriate for me, and so for years I thought Faces of Death I bought into the hype behind it, kind of like with Cannibal Holocaust. I thought it was a real film depicting real events. It wasn't until much later in life that I learned that while some of the footage was actually real footage, most of it was just made up for the movies. But here I am as an 8-year-old child thinking, oh my god, these cultists were actually so brazen in their actions, they let a film crew come in and film them cannibalizing a live human.
Yeah, I remember hearing that they actually went to court about that, because that was near I think it was like after Italy left like the Giallo phase behind, they started really getting into this like cannibal phase, inspired from like their shockumentaries, and Cannibal Holocaust was kind of the tipping point for that before the outrage about that forced them to start switching over into doing the zombie movies.
Oh yeah, the Cannibal Holocaust, he actually had to go back and get cast members to come testify in court to prove
yeah, they didn't eat me, I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah, that they were alive. Which, I mean, in this day and age, with information so readily available, that's kind of, that doesn't exist anymore. But, you look even just a few years back at the initial Blair Witch Project. That viral marketing campaign had so many people believing that it was a real story.
Based on a true story.
Yeah.
Just like Paranormal Activity.
And there's still people today that fall for this. My sister-in-law, she got into a huge argument with me one day because she watched the first Paranormal Activity movie and she insisted that it was real footage. And I'm like, no, Cindy, it's a theatrical film.
It's important to understand that based on a real story means this is not a real story.
Well, she pointed out the fact that in either the intro credits or the outro credits, it says, this footage, we had permission from the family to use this footage to show the story. I actually had to go get the DVD and show her that there were alternate endings before she would believe me that was not real captured footage of a supernatural event.
And she was what, like 16, 18?
Oh no, she was in her early 20s.
Oh no, I forgot when that came out. Oof.
Makes me shudder to think what would happen if she watched the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
So, do you seen like a whole lot of the Hammer horror movies then? Or is it mostly The Mummy?
I've seen my fair share. A lot of them I've seen when I was much younger, so my memory's not fresh on them. A lot of them I went back and watched again. Some of my favorite films even are from, like the later Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. I love that movie. I can accept, and with a name like that and
I
a
was laughing
premise.
just because of the name. I keep going.
Well, I think I had you sit down and watch it with me. It's been a long time ago if I have. But you expect this really campy, kind of like Billy the Kid versus Dracula. And it's not anything like that. That's a real movie, by the way. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but there is a Billy the Kid versus Dracula. And it's as goofy as it sounds, but it has its place in the pantheons of horror. But it's not. It's actually this really atmospheric piece about this guy who goes around and hunts vampires, and he comes up against a badass, basically, for lack of a better term. But my dad, too, I can remember being, very young, and we would do something like watch the first Halloween film. And he loved to point out, like the IMDb section now for Goofs, he would point out stuff like the cigarette smoke in the first Halloween movie. There's a scene where Laurie and her friends are walking down the street. It's when Michael's initially stalking them after school, and they walk by a bush, and if you watch the screen, you can see a wisp of cigarette smoke go across the screen, and none of them are smoking. And I remember my dad making such a big deal of it, but he loved to pause movies and stuff, and he'd show me, you see that right there? I bet someone lost their job that day. And
I guess before there was IMDb, before the internet, I guess that kind of info was pretty valuable.
Well, and with my dad too. Once my dad was ready to go to bed, me and my sister had to entertain ourselves. Now, there were 2 VHS tapes in particular that my dad had that we probably watched, because we saw him every other weekend. So we probably watched these tapes literally for years, at least once a month. The first tape was an extended length recording cassette, and it had Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors was the first film on it. The second one was The Gates of Hell, aka City of the Living Dead, and Alice Cooper's Monster Dog.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. I've heard of it, but...
It is an experience. There is a music video and song for the movie. It's actually it's worth seeing, if nothing else, for the novelty of it.
How does it repair with Reanimate Your Feet?
Reanimate Your Feet is a classic.
What's the movie that one's from? It's I know it's the third Reanimator movie.
Beyond Reanimator.
Beyond Reanimator.
I'm sad we never got a President Jeffrey Combs, but
Yeah, not enough horror movies have music videos anymore. We had
Night Train to Terror.
Well, no, I was going to cite. I'll have to look it up, but whatever band it was that was in the Nightmare on Elm Street one.
Oh, you had Dream Warriors, which was Dokken, I believe.
Yeah, and they have
Dream Warriors.
My sister likes going on rants about Dokken being there and just talking about how they were doing tons of drugs and how they were just out of their minds through the whole filming of that music video, and about band members recounting seeing Robert Englund in his makeup. Well, maybe I should stop.
Nothing for me tops Man Behind the Mask for Friday the 13th Part 6, though.
I genuinely like that song. I love that one.
Oh, I do too, and I love the music video, even with Brachiation Jason.
Or I guess, as we'll get to later on this episode, I recently saw Maniac Cop 2, which I think you told me you haven't finished.
Oh, no, I've watched all 3 of them.
Oh, okay, so you're familiar with the amazingly bad rap at the end of Maniac Cop 2.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and that brings me, the other tape my dad had was Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. And for years I thought it was just a nostalgia from watching that movie so much that made it my favorite. But as I will readily admit, I am a Jason fan. I'm not a Friday the 13th. I am a Friday the 13th fan, but I am a Jason fan first and foremost. You've known me for a long time. You know that Friday the 13th Part 1 is one of my least favorite films of the series. And it's not that I don't think it is a seminal film in the history of horror. It's not that I don't think it is a good Friday the 13th film. Its appeal to me as a horror film is less than a film that features Jason, and Friday the 13th Part 6 was just amazing. And when you watch a movie, at least once a month for 5 to 10 years, it sticks with you. And there's so many things I love about that movie.
Was 6 the first one you saw? Or?
Yes, that's the first one I have concrete memory in my head of seeing, because it was at such a young age. But, this was around, 7 or 8, so we're talking, 1990, 1991. So you compound that with stuff like Are You Afraid of the Dark? That launched in 1990. SNCC was every weekend that me and my brother and my sister were home. My dad didn't have cable, so we had to entertain ourselves other ways. But SNCC, that was what I looked forward to most, was Are You Afraid of the Dark? And 1990 also gave us the It miniseries, which I begged my parents to watch. They didn't want to let me watch it. And it wasn't because they thought I was too young. It's because I had a terrible fear of clowns when I was a child, because my grandparents had one of these, it's not a porcelain doll, but it was like a Harlequin clown. It was kind of chubby.
I mean, the Harlequin ones are spookier than the rodeo clowns or the circus clowns.
But it was like a happy, jovial, chubby Harlequin clown. It looked kind of like the one from The Tale of the Crimson Clown and Are You Afraid of the Dark? And it had a key on its back, and when you turned the key, its head would bob and its hips would move, and it would play this song. And as a child, I would swear to my parents and my grandparents that thing, because I would sleep in the living room when I spent the night with my grandparents, and I would swear that thing would just start playing by itself. Whether that was true or not.
You're giving me vibes of that cymbal playing monkey from Poltergeist.
Yeah.
Or is that Poltergeist 1 or 2?
I believe that belongs in the first one. Because the second one, the only really toy you had was the phone, the Fisher-Price phone.
Yeah.
That Carol Ann spoke to her grandmother on. And, just shortly after that, and this is probably not going to strike a lot of people, something that would be formative in someone's horror upbringing, as it were. But 1991, we had Salute Your Shorts, which was a phenomenal show. I loved it, but the second episode of the series featured, it was titled Zeke The Plumber, and it was all about this creepy-ass character. And of course, it's just ugly in a mask, but you don't know that. Like I said, I was 8 years old, so I'm watching this kind of Nightmare on Elm Street knockoff, and the guy's got a plunger.
I should say, I saw that same episode, and I remember, I don't remember it being scary, but I do remember loving that episode and always wishing he'd come back on the show. I don't imagine there'll be another time that'll be very good for us to discuss Zeke the Plumber, but what was his backstory?
I think he deserves his own episode.
Oh, do you? I'm sure.
I'm sure there's tons of fan fiction out there.
You link some my way. We'll put it in the show notes. But the fact that he was a plumber wasn't too relevant, right? It was something like there was like a gas leak, and
that's the whole premise. He was in the army, and I believe it was the Philippines. A parrot bit off his nose, so that's why he had the tape over his nose, and he was digging a hole. You never really find out why he was digging this hole, but he accidentally struck a gas line, which makes no sense for a plumber. A popular theory is that when they say gas line, they don't actually mean like natural gas or propane, that it was like sewage gas.
It's a camp story made by camp kids. Salute Your Shorts was a show about a bunch of kids in a summer camp. It was an early Nickelodeon show, one of those YA sitcom type shows, but since it's about a horror camp, or summer camp, you have to have an episode about telling scary stories, and I'm not sure what the real logic behind it was with his mask, if it was just supposed to be that his face had gotten melted by the gas explosion, or if they just had a low budget for the show, so when they need to make somebody without a nose, the only way to do it is to replace the whole face. But probably because of how cheaply and poorly made the mask was, it actually made it end up looking really, really creepy, because it looked not quite human.
Oh yeah, with the wig and that horrible mask. Yeah, it's just... It's terrifying when you look at him, and oh yeah, it was definitely a budget thing because in the canon of the show, I don't think he's actually wearing a mask. That's supposed to really be his face, but it's so absurd now as an adult. The guy had a plumber, but he was very obviously, a huge reference to Freddy Krueger.
It'd be interesting to go back now and look at staff, like writers for that specific episode, and see if there was any bleed over to Are You Afraid of the Dark? Because I believe they were all those Nickelodeon shows were the same like studios.
I know they all had, they all shared a lot of cast because, they were all Canadian, not all of them, but there were a lot of Canadian actors because, a lot of Nickelodeon's early programming came from Canadian studios, stuff like, you can't do that on television, which is horrifying in its own right, but not this type of horrifying.
It's a psychological thriller. You can't do that on television.
In more ways than one. Now, my grandmother, she was in there too. She was a huge Stephen King fan. Now, she read a lot of stuff, and her appreciation of King wasn't so much as a horror writer. It was that she enjoyed, reading, and Stephen King wrote good stuff. So I remember some stuff she would let me read, some stuff she wouldn't, because a lot of his stuff wasn't age appropriate for a 9 or 10-year-old to read. She let me read some stuff, though, because I read and comprehended at a level that was a little bit above my age. So, and then I had my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and that was my maternal grandmother I was speaking about. He would stay up late when I spent the night with him, and we would watch all of this weird stuff that if it were not for him, I never even would have known of. And a lot of it's not necessarily horror, but a lot of fantastical stuff. Things like Krull, which definitely has horror elements in it.
Sure.
Because when I watched that movie for the first time as an adult, I had no recollection of when the enemy soldiers were killed, their heads cracking open and the little slugs slithering out. Or little alien beings.
Yeah, a lot of those fantasy movies were like that, like Legend. I mean, I used to think of that one as a horror movie when I was younger. It has, witches, has the devil in it. I mean, it's a little plainer in that, I guess.
And I also had full access to their VHS cabinet when they were asleep, so the first time I saw Jacob's Ladder was at my grandparents', and as you know, to this day, that is a phenomenal horror film. I love it for its overtones, and that wasn't necessarily so much pushing towards my horror, but a love of the fantastical, and in a lot of ways, horror and the fantastical overlap or complement each other very well. Stuff like Night of the Living Dead, which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. My mom had this thing where I would be sitting in the living room and her and my stepfather would be sitting in their bedroom, and she would call out to me and she would say, "Hey Daniel, hey son, X movie's on." I'd be like, "What is that?" And she'd be like, "Well, it's this movie where this happens, or it's got, this guy from this movie." That's how I saw Labyrinth for the first time. It's how I saw The Neverending Story for the first time. It's how I saw Night of the Living Dead for the first time. And she actually came in there and watched that with me, and that movie blew me away. As a 10-year-old kid, watching a black and white movie was not overly appealing, but I loved Night of the Living Dead. I've always loved zombies, you know that. My dad, however, messed up because he let me watch Return of the Living Dead 2. And while I loved Night of the Living Dead, that was the recently dead getting back up. Bodies that are still laying in morgues, people that have just died. Return of the Living Dead as a franchise features zombies burrowing out of their grave, which is much more terrifying, especially considering that my father lived in a very small town in Georgia and was less than a mile from a cemetery.
Yeah, now you're not fighting against this week's obituaries page. You're fighting against the whole history of humanity.
Yes, and it was terrifying. Thriller was the same. Believe it or not, as a young child, Thriller scared the piss out of me because it had amazing effects, for one. And the tone, despite being a music video, is very creepy. And you have, Vincent Price doing the voiceover.
Yeah, I remember being really into Thriller, too.
Oh. And when they're trapped in the house near the end and the zombies are busting up through the floor, that always reminded me of the scene in Night of the Creeps where the main detective character had buried the killer he shot years and years ago, and he burrows up out of the ground. There's something that's a lot more terrifying about zombies when a 20-year decayed corpse can bust out of a coffin, and as I got older, learned about burial vaults and stuff. So not only are you busting out of a coffin that is potentially not just made out of wood, you're also burrowing through a vault and then through 6 feet of dirt.
Yeah, I remember it was a long time before I saw any of the Return to Living Deads, but at one point I saw on TV, just in passing, a clip that I think was from Return of the Living Dead 2, where they have a undead girl that has like no lower torso strapped down on a table. And it's got like an animatronic spinal cord flipping back and forth on the table.
That's the first Return of the Dead.
Oh, it is? Okay, yeah.
Or Return of the Living Dead.
I remember seeing that scene, and that I did not know what that movie was, and at this point I was pretty used to watching horror movies, and not many of them scared me anymore, but that scene scared me, and I desperately wanted to know what that movie was, but I just saw it passing from one room to another, and then I was in the middle of something, and I couldn't stop, and I spent a long time wondering what that terrifying thing was.
Ugh. That scene is really peculiar because I remembered very little of Return of the Living Dead 2 when I saw it as a child.
And also, I think in that scene, that's one of the few times where they get like the dead to like just have a conversation with them because they got it strapped down. And I remember the idea that it could... Normally it seems pretty hokey to have the undead be able to actually converse with you, but for some reason at that point it seemed really scary to me. I think it was just because it's something that dead trying to communicate.
Yes, and see, as a child, I didn't remember those aspects of Return of the Living Dead. Even when I saw one of the very early Simpsons Treehouse of Horrors, these zombies are walking around saying brains, and I'm like, zombies don't talk, because I'd forgotten that aspect of Return of the Living Dead, and so I was looking at it entirely from a Night of the Living Dead aspect. I hadn't even seen Dawn of the Dead at this point. And, you know, later on I saw those movies, and I agree with you, they, the Return of the Living Dead movies, especially the first one, did a very good job of taking something that would normally be hokey and campy, and is, in fairness, played for laughs for most of the film. You know, like, send more cops or send more paramedics, you know, stuff like that. But then you have this horrific scene where they have this zombie strapped down to a table, and she's like, we eat brains because it hurts being dead, and eating brains makes the pain go away. It's a really creepy scene. And don't get me started how in Return of the Living Dead, destroying the brain doesn't work. You know, you gotta shoot them in the head. You know, that doesn't work.
In any undead scenario where shooting them in the brain doesn't work, I mean, you might as well just give up at that point. In any of those movies where it's like severed hands are crawling around getting people, you've lost then.
Or fast zombies. I'm sorry.
You just gotta hope there's a timeline on that it runs out at that point, I guess.
When zombies can climb fences and open doors and run, we're done for. And then, you know, I was telling you earlier, my dad was very into these horror movies also that had overly sexual themes. My dad always let me pick out whatever I wanted, you know, especially once I got like 10 or 11. When we'd go stay with him on the weekends, we'd go to the video store, we'd pick out whatever we want. That's how I discovered the Warlock movies, because I started with the second one. I mean, if you'll remember, in like 6th grade, I even had that little RPG, you know, tabletop RPG I created that was based on being a druid from the second Warlock film.
I just played the Super Nintendo games.
And then I showed up one time, and my dad had one of his friends with him, and they were all excited because they were telling me about this horror movie that had been shot in Georgia. And there was an abandoned camp near where my dad lived in Bremen, Georgia. And they thought that this abandoned camp was where this movie was shot. So they somehow got the impression that it was the first sleepaway camp film. So we went and rented it. And let me tell you, when you're 11 or 12 and you have seen that movie fresh for the first time, because for the majority of the film, it's just like any other slasher, except it's a girl doing it. But then you get to like the final scenes in that film. I mean, that movie messed with me in so many ways, because you pan onto the main character, and she's sitting there with her boyfriend's head in her lap, and she's not a girl. So, you know, mangled dicks have become, you know, kind of a joke around that, you know, franchise, especially with Felissa Rose, the actress from the Sleepaway Camp series. That's one of her big catchphrases now. So, you know, it works. And I think, you know, for that movie being what it is, that was, you know, kind of a fresh ending for the time. You know, we didn't have 100 movies back then that were, had twists like that. You had a few, and most of them that I can think of even came later. Stuff like April Fool's Day, that had kind of a twist ending, but it was very different, but and I was kind of sheltered growing up along those lines, so that was really confusing to me. It was a long time before I realized what the hell I'd seen. And it was around this time I started watching TNT with Joe Bob Briggs' Monster Vision. TNT Monster Vision.
It would have been around this time that we actually became acquainted, I think.
Yep. And that opened my eyes to an entirely new set of films I had never seen before. Things like People Under the Stairs, Big Trouble in Little China, not entirely horror, but it fits. Phantasm 2 and 3, Deadly Friend, which I love to this day. I think it's an underrated gem, but it is super campy and hokey, but I love it for what it is. You get to see Ma Fratelli get her head exploded with a basketball, so what's not to love? Night of the Lepus, you would never think that a movie about rabbits would be scary, but The Hand was probably one of my earliest exposures to something that was more suspense than outright horror, but it worked. Around this time, you also had USA Up All Night. And there were all kind of movies on there that were either horror movies or they kind of skewed the lines. Things like the original Swamp Thing, the Toxic Avenger, these kind of hybrid films that had all these horror overtones, but, could easily fit in the other various other genres. But I think the single biggest, impact was... when I was around 14 years old or so, is when eBay became a thing for me, because in the internet in general, we grew up at a time when the internet was just starting to bud, and all of a sudden I could find these movies that I'd just seen scenes from, and not only could I find out what these movies were, it suddenly became very easy and accessible for me to go to this place, search for the movie, and be able to buy it.
Yeah, because like I said, it might be some younger listeners might not really be aware, but for a long time, when you had a series you're into, you might have seen part 2 and part 6, and you hadn't seen any of the others, and you just had to wait and hope maybe someday they'd be on TV somewhere, or maybe someday some store would happen to have one of them available for rent. And if you ever ran into somebody that had seen them, you had to beg them to tell you all the details they remembered, so you knew what happened in parts 3 and 5. And of course, these days now it's you just what it is, you Google it and then you find it and watch it.
Oh, well, even then, if it was anecdotal from someone else, you never knew whether you were getting the truth or not.
True.
I remember when Jason Goes to Hell came out, there was a kid at school that swore up and down he had seen it. He swore up and down that I didn't watch half the movies I said I did, because he thought I made up the whole thing with my father really let me have a lot of freedom, rent whatever I wanted. So he was like, if you've seen Jason Goes to Hell, then what does he do after he captures the first girl? And I'm like, he doesn't capture her. He gets blown up. And he was like, nuh-uh, he captures her and he has sex with her. And I'm like, really?
I mean, I feel like in high school, I played that or watched that. What happened? If they had sex, that's usually what people went with. To be fair, I mean, if you'd never seen Friday the 13th Part 7 and you asked what happened and somebody said, oh, Jason fights a psychic girl, you probably wouldn't believe them.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I love Friday the 13th Part 7. There is something about Laura Park Lincoln. She beats Jason's ass. I mean, it's
it's Carrie versus Jason Voorhees, pretty much.
Yeah, and, some people gave Jason a good run for his money. I don't know, I feel like Tommy's more effective in the final chapter than he is in Jason Lives, because he just seems, to get his ass kicked and get arrested a lot.
Stop practicing all that jujitsu.
And then Friday the 13th Part 5, the first time I saw that one, and he was suddenly Scorpion from Mortal Kombat. He was this martial arts master that was just, destroying people twice his size and a decade older than him, and he's just Bruce Lee the hell out of him.
I mean, some people have their coping mechanisms for slasher PTSD.
Oh, yeah. And, Part 6, he's reverted to things like, hey, maggot head. I mean, And, around the time with eBay, that opened up a lot of things. The first time I saw Dawn of the Dead was because I'd got on the internet, found out about Night of the Living Dead, and I found out there were other films, and one of the first things I ever bought off eBay was Dawn of the Dead. And I remember when I got it, you and our little cloistered group of friends, we all sat down and watched it together. And
I didn't remember that was your first time seeing it.
Yes, the time I watched it with you guys was my first time seeing that film.
Oh, wow.
And I remember just like, I don't know how strong of an impact it had on you, but even though the effects...
That was amazing, yeah. I mean, zombie movies were zombie movies for me up until that point. That was the first one I saw. I was like, whoa, this is not just a zombie movie. I mean, in multiple ways, it's like the characters were more developed, the soundtrack was good, it had some good, like, psychological thriller stuff, like the beginning dream sequence, then it has the social commentary, and just the sets were interesting, and it has a bunch of lightheartedness mixed in with the horror.
Exactly, it's about people living. It's not, the zombies are a major factor in it, but it's about the people living. And, when I'd become a fan of Night of the Living Dead, to me it was just like, oh, cool, zombies. But then once I saw Dawn of the Dead, I realized, that Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead were like these character pieces where zombies were just like the backdrop to tell this story, and it made me appreciate it. And as far as the music, yes, Dawn of the Dead, most of Fulci's films, especially City of the Living Dead, The Gates of Hell, that movie terrified the hell out of me as a child, not only because it had supernatural teleporting hide in your closet zombies. Magic zombies are always way more terrifying than standard zombies, but the music, the Italian zombie craze, the music in those films was terrifying. Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, the music in that film just makes every scene in it just that much more terrifying because the music is almost a character itself in those films. But that opened up a lot of other stuff too. Dawn of the Dead, Reanimator. The first time I saw it was because of eBay. The Unnameable was eBay. That was also, my first exposure. At the time, my knowledge of H.P. Lovecraft was, hey, there's all these movies that are called H.P. Lovecrafts. I had never been exposed to him as a writer at that time, but I knew I liked these movies. I remember even back then, I would get on there and I would be looking for a VHS and realize that it was a rare, out-of-print VHS and wonder why it was like $50, $60, and it just blew my mind. So the eBay, the whole eBay thing, that, opened up a lot of venues for me to expose myself to other horror. And around this time, you also had Blockbuster Video, which was obviously very popular around this time. There's not really a such thing as a brick and mortar rental store anymore. There was an employee who worked at our local Blockbuster that suggested In the Mouth of Madness to me, Event Horizon. Those movies, introduced me to the more psychological horror and started like this whole new fandom for me. Really enjoyed those films. And then, of course, there was the bag under the house. There used to be a small tanning salon / video rental place in the small town me and you both grew up in, and my sister was friends with the daughter of the man who owned it, and years later the store had been shut down, and my
mom used to go there to get tans, but I didn't have any direct relation with the people there.
I was hanging out at their house one day, and we had just watched Scream 2, and she told me, well, we got to talking about horror films, and she's like, oh, well, we've got tons of movies under the house. So they took me to the crawl space, and as an adult, thinking about this, it's a little weird. So I go into the crawl space, and there's just duffel bags upon duffel bags.
You're about to be in your own horror movie.
Yes.
And we got plenty of horror movies. You're in one.
But there's just duffel bags full of VHS tapes, and I just grabbed everything I can that looks even remotely horror. And that's, how we were exposed to Night Train to Terror, Dungeon Master. I don't know if you remember that, Jim. Eaten Alive, which was an early Tobe Hooper film that I'd never heard of that also has Robert Englund in it. Black Evil. That was my first exposure whatsoever to a blaxploitation film. I'd never even heard of that as a genre till that point. And it just kind of grew and sprouted from there, and then the shared things that we've exposed each other to over the years, it just kind of blossomed from there, and that brought us, to the point we're at now.
And I remember in high school you were reading like Fangoria even back then. Do you remember when you got into that?
Oh yeah, well the it wasn't an FYE. There was some kind of music. So it might have been a Sam Goodies that my dad used to go to, and he would let us pick out a magazine or a CD or something whenever we went. And I started picking up Fangoria. And whenever we would go to the mall, I would go across the street to, I believe at the time it was a Books A Million. I would go in there and I would find, Fangoria. Eventually, you had things like Rue Morgue, but I would pick up Fangoria, and I remember saving up some birthday money, and I actually had a subscription to it at one point, Heavy Metal and Fangoria.
I remember seeing a mag issue of it when I came to visit you once, and it just blew my mind at the time that there was like full magazines for it. I think it had an article like talking about Friday the 13th Part 8, and then it was like discussing upstumming stuff about Jason X.
Oh, yes. Jason X, I have an issue that talks about Jason X. I still have all my old Fangoria issues. I have one talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, Freddy vs. Jason, all kind of crazy stuff in there. And I just thought it was awesome because there were tons of movies that I had no idea were even coming out till I looked into those magazines and found out about them. It's how I got into J-horror was thanks to Fangoria. But, as far as my formative years, that's pretty much the whole story. It all evolved from there, and the internet, especially the early internet, digging around on old websites like there was a Friday the 13th website called The Dirt Mound. I believe it was an old AOL or GDO Cities website, so it doesn't exist anymore. But it was...
Is that where you got those indie Friday the 13th games you made me play?
Oh, yes. I finally found the name of the guy, his production studio that made those games, but unfortunately I can't find them anywhere anymore.
I'm assuming production studio is a little glamorous for this.
Well, you know what I mean. They actually had a name, but I can't find any of those games anymore. It's just a little depressing, but that'll about wrap that point up for me.
Okay, well, that was as I expected a lot from that, and that was definitely a lot, but I've always consistently, you were the horror guy among the people I knew, and we're probably here because of you. Obviously, for me to latch onto that, it had to come from somewhere with me, so I guess I'll get into that a bit. Similarly to how you said that your dad was always really into a bunch of horror stuff, like the Hammer horror and so on, I think it was my mom for that. I don't think my father had any interest in any of that stuff. He was more into westerns and things like that. But my mom, I know they had a king-size bed in their bedroom, and the headboard of it was a bookshelf, and it was edge-to-edge novels by people like Stephen King and Dean Koontz. I think it was mostly Dean Koontz.
John Coyne.
You had to get that one in, didn't you? Yep.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was about to say we had, aside from completely filling that up, we also had a separate bookshelf out in the living room that was also filled up with this stuff, and that's where the John Coyne Hobgoblin that I read was, and yeah, I remember she told me before, because I kept seeing Stephen King movies, and I asked her why I wasn't seeing a bunch of Dean Koontz movies when she seemed to like him more, and she basically told me that she preferred him because his stuff was less supernatural than Stephen King. And she probably shouldn't have told me that, because I think that kind of steered me away from reading too many of them myself. I remember I read I unfortunately don't remember the title. I went digging for it, but I couldn't find it. But I do remember reading some Dean Koontz book of hers about a mother that keeps a daughter out in the woods because she's supposedly disfigured, and then a bunch of kids decide they're gonna make a pact to find this kid just so they can see her and freak out about how she actually looks.
Well, when you think about books, me and you both, we grew up in the era of Goosebumps, the scary stories to tell in the dark, things like that. Those were all widely popular. The Fear Street books, which you actually got me into that whole series a lot.
Oh yeah, don't believe me, I'll be getting into all that in a second here. But yeah, so I used to just randomly pick books out of her bookshelf and read those, but even before that, I mean, it wasn't just books. She was really into horror movies. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, like you mentioned, I feel like that was one of the first movies I could remember watching, honestly. And then aside from that, I remember she was really into, I guess she did seem to like the ones that weren't too supernatural and like effects heavy. I remember she was really into The Changeling, and, well, I don't know, she did like One Dark Night a lot, so. But, and my brothers, actually, they had a big Freddy Krueger poster on their bedroom. I always thought it was cool, but I remember my sister, she always hated it, and I had to like escort her through the hallway if it was laid out because she didn't want to walk past Freddy Krueger alone. But yeah, I think Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, for a long time to me, that was like what horror movies were, and it was all like the supernatural special effects stuff, like mostly just that scene at the beginning where she's carrying the little girl trying to run from Freddy, and then the floor underneath her starts getting hard to move through, and she realizes she's wading through blood, and then she looks down, and the little girl she was carrying is a skeleton now. That made a pretty big impression on me. But it was as much that scary as it was this is cool. I think very early in my life, scary movies stopped being scary to me and just started being kind of cool and interesting to me. And I did have a kind of steady lean towards the more supernatural things like that. And I remember like being really into like Poltergeist and Waxworks and things like that when I was younger.
Ooh, Waxworks! You introduced me to that series of films.
Oh man, Waxworks 2 is kind of rough, but Waxworks 1, I love that movie. We had that on VHS, and I watched it so many times that the VHS tape broke and started coming apart, and I had to do VHS tape surgery and move the film to another cassette, and I was so terrified that I was going to mess up while doing it and never be able to watch Waxworks again. But even though my dad wasn't into any horror movies, really, he was oddly really into Alice Cooper, not nearly on the same level that yours was, but I do remember being in the car one day, and usually if my mom was in the car, we always had to listen to, like, some Genesis or Phil Collins or some modern pop, but whenever it was, like, just my dad in the car, he'd, like, play his stuff, and I remember one day being in his car, and he was playing some Alice Cooper's Welcome to My Nightmare, which, has Vincent Price on it on the Black Widow track, and the Steven and Years Ago tracks on the end that are, like, really spooky stuff. I remember I loved that cassette tape, and I since he couldn't really listen to it that often, I just borrowed it from him, and I just kept it for months, listening to that pretty much every night. Something I was surprised you didn't talk about much was, I guess to me, like, horror movies were, like, so common in my household, I didn't really think about them much as anything special, and I felt like that was, like, just a societal thing at large, because, I mean, there was so many cartoons when I was growing up that were all horror themed that I felt like I was watching all the time, like, Scooby-Doo, Groovy Ghoulies, Count Duckula, and stuff like that. I felt like horror was, like, everywhere. So it didn't really register as like this special separate genre. I don't think that really started hitting me until I was in school, and things like Are You Afraid of the Dark were on the air, and I remember being on a bus and talking with a kid about Are You Afraid of the Dark, and we got a little bit into the conversation, and he told me that he wasn't allowed to watch it because he got too scared watching one of the episodes. And I was pretty young then, so I mean I don't think I called him out on it, but in my mind, certainly at the time, I was just thinking, how could you be so scared of Are You Afraid of the Dark? That's nowhere near as bad as like Poltergeist 2 or Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Or even Tales from the Dark Side or something.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I love Tales from the Dark Side a lot too. I think, actually, horror-wise, once I discovered like the anthology format, that was really what I was into. I think there's just something about the short stories that appeal to me a lot more. When you have like the full cinematic film, you have a need to flesh things out a lot more. You normally establish how the monster came to be, what its lore is, what it's doing, what the ending is, and with the short story, you don't really go into all that. You just have just enough to set up the scare and have the payoff, and maybe a little bit of a twist, but it's...
Well, in anthologies, too, you tend to have a lot more dark endings because there's not always time for this, rosy resolution you get in horror movies sometimes. But, in a lot of anthology series... Tales from the Dark Side, Tales from the Crypt, Friday the 13th series, which not really anthology, but, along the same lines. Even Goosebumps, the series, these things ended, they always kind of ended on a dark note rather than a resolution. There was a supposed resolution, but, you always had that little hint of it's not really over, which a lot of movies did too, but it always seemed to stick more in an anthology format because you knew you weren't going to get 6 more sequels to that story.
Yeah, and speaking of Goosebumps, yeah, that occupied me for a pretty long time.
Well, I think that was the initial thing me and you bonded over at a vacation Bible school. You lent me one of the Give Yourself Goosebumps or one of the anthology collections, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a few of those. I always wanted more, but yeah, Goosebumps started in '92, and I remember going to like a book fair at the school I was going to, and they had number 11, The Haunted Mask there, and of course, that was really the only thing that stood out there as a horror book to me, so I scooped that up right away. It helped that it had a cutout mask in the back to wear that was too small for my face. And yeah, I got super into that series, and I eventually just got to a point where it was just any time I knew my mom was going to the store, I would be like, Mom, when you go there, it's important. Make sure you look for Goosebumps number 4, 7, and 9. Those are the ones I need. And eventually I got to a point where I had 1 through 50 of the whole series, missing like 2 of them, and eventually I relented at that point and just mail ordered those last 2.
You were my lifeline for Goosebumps. The first Goosebumps book I actually received myself was one of my Christmas gifts, and it was, I believe, Ghost Beach, the one where the 2 kids are visiting their grandparents or their aunt and uncles, and they live on like this coastal like cottage, and they don't realize that they're a ghost.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Most Goosebumps stories have a really like tongue-in-cheek, kind of like half-humor vibe to them. I think Ghost Beach was one of the few that was just straight horror.
Oh yeah, but
at least that's how I remember it.
I believe that was one of the later books, and that was my first book I actually owned myself. Pretty much every one of them I read was via you.
It's funny. I was thinking in my head, I was like, that's like number 23 or so, and I looked it up just now, and it's 22, so close. But yeah, a lot of those are burnt into my brain, and a lot of them are burnt into my brain because I spent so long staring at the list of them all, thinking about the ones that I needed to get but didn't have yet.
Welcome to the Dead House is still one of my favorites, and it's still one of the most legitimately scary ones in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's number 1, and that's one of the most straight horror ones in the series, yeah. It kind of followed the same vibe that most horror series do, where it started out kind of more straight horror, but then the longer it went on, it started getting campier and campier. And I remember around the time that they were getting to around issue 50, I started getting this feeling that I was starting to get a little too old for it. I wanted something actually spookier, and I was reading a bit of like Fear Street at the time, not too much though. I mean, they came out with Goosebumps 2000, and I thought that's what that was going to be, but it was pretty much just the same, and I got disappointed and decided to move on from Goosebumps. And I guess I picked a bad time to do it, because when I looked up like how long it kept going afterward, there was really only like 5 or 6 more books that came out after I stopped. It's kind of funny, the TV show, I never really watched it or liked it. I think I saw 2 episodes and was disappointed with how much they didn't match up to my probably unrealistic expectations. But I see these days a lot of time online, people having nostalgia for the TV show, and kind of like how you and I talk about how Are You Afraid of the Dark, and like how spooky that intro seemed to us as kids. I see people saying that about the Goosebumps intro these days.
Oh god, that's like so tame compared to Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Yeah, I know. It's mostly like when it has the dog and its eyes glow. People, for some reason, that scared kids.
That was so campy, though. I mean, I guess I can get it. It was a different time.
Well, hey, you've got a dog, right? I mean, not you specifically, but a lot of people have dogs. What if your dog's eyes glow?
I think the worst part about the Goosebump intro was the briefcase flying open and the pages swarming around town.
I'll be honest, I don't even remember that bit. But yeah, so I think horror for me, it was a lot more of just a normal thing, so I didn't really give it much special attention other than I realized that I liked reading it a lot. So I guess I kind of had a horror movie phase, and then I switched into like the Goosebumps and Fear Street phase, where I was just... And I read some other stuff too, like John Coyne, like you said, or I read a little bit of Christopher Pike. And then I think pretty much all that kind of cut out once horror video games started to be a thing, and then it was just Resident Evil and Silent Hill and Fear Effect maybe not in the same pedigree as the rest of those, but and then I think I kept sort of passively seeing horror movies now and then, mostly through you, I think, but it was mostly horror games I was into for a good while after that. And I think it wasn't until I started realizing, getting older, and you start realizing that all like art and media is inspired and based on other things, and when I started hitting that phase, that's when I started having a more historic appreciation for it. Realizing things like all these things in Silent Hill are references to Jacob's Ladder,
I definitely
and so I
get
need
that.
to go watch Jacob's Ladder.
Well, and especially the first Resident Evil. It was such a love letter to, like, Romero zombie movies and over-the-top action films of the 80s, stuff like that kind of, cross the genres, stuff like They Live.
Yeah, I think, actually, speaking of genres, I think that's probably part of what made me sort of get out of horror movies for a while, is so much of what I liked about them was the supernatural stuff. When I think of horror movies, I think of you, like, having to wade through blood or step against stairs that turn into mush under your feet, or ghosts floating around. You look in a mirror and you see a scary version of yourself, or...
Oh, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, the opening, that is the most legitimately scary portion of any Nightmare on Elm Street movie for me. Put me down, you're hurting me.
But yeah, once you hit the, once you got to the late 90s, a lot of horror was franchises at that point, and they had all been going on so long that they'd stopped being scary and were starting to become, like, more funny and campy. Trying to do twists, like, what if it's Hellraiser, but it's in space? What if it's Friday the 13th, but it's in space? Or what if it's
space is the inevitable end for all.
What if it's
Leprechaun?
Yeah. What if it's Halloween, but Busta Rhymes is there and we're filming a reality TV show? And then so to sort of get back on track, a sort of trend hit horror movies where they started trying to be more realistic, and you got to the phase where you had like Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and then Scream, I think, is what really made it blow up. And then after that, horror movies were all things like Hostel and Saw, and the more supernatural element, well, of course it never went away. It sort of dwindled off for a bit, and I wasn't really in the horror underground enough then to really keep up with it, so I think that's what got me into the video games, where everything was very supernatural. And I enjoyed my Fatal Frames and Haunting Grounds and things like that, and as far as the movies went, I only really started caring in a sort of historical context, and that's when I finally started going back and rewatching a lot of these early, like, Universal Century horror movies and things like that. But even then, I never really felt too much like I was really into horror, even though, I clearly was. It just always seemed normal to be into those things to me.
Well, you and I saw a lot of horror movies together in the theater, too, over the years.
I remember seeing 28 Days Later with you, of course.
Yes, it saved us from paying to see Terminator 3.
Exactly, that's the true horror.
The Grudge.
Oh, we did. Oh, okay. So yeah, we saw The Grudge together, and I remember also seeing Freddy vs. Jason with you.
More than once.
So anyways, yeah, I think that's really about it for me. Obviously, a much less of a pedigree. It was horror was always so passively around me that I just always was just taking it in. And it wasn't until kind of I reached an older phase and started getting into like the historical context of it, started going through all the old things. And then as a result of that, I started realizing how much there was modern that I wasn't really into. When I finally hit the point where I realized I have seen all the Nightmare on Elm Streets now, and I finally have seen all the Friday the 13ths. And I started thinking about how I'd seen like one or two Saws, and then I look and realize, oh wait, there's like 8 Saw movies now, and oh, that Paranormal Activity thing, there's like 7 of those now, and I realized that there's a whole other generation of horror that happened while I was catching up, and it's sort of been inspired me to try to really like get back into it and get caught up on a lot of these things. And I guess speaking of that, I guess this might be as good a time as any for us to start to talk a little bit about what we've been engaging with currently in horror, if you think that's a good time.
Yeah, sure.
I can feel myself rot.
Eating brains. How does that make you feel?
It makes the pain go away.
Now that I think we've sufficiently covered where we come from and how we got here, I think we can go ahead and start talking about what we're doing here. This is going to be our sort of current events or new releases section, where we just talk about what things horror we've recently engaged with. Not necessarily reviews per se, just sort of discussion. Again, that will be movies, books, games, whatever it is that we feel like talking about. I've got a pretty decent mix this time. I guess I'll go ahead and start. Something else I've been reading it lately, just because as I said, I've been really into short story anthologies. I've actually been picking up a whole lot of different anthology type things lately. And in the process of digging around and scooping up different ones, I discovered a publisher called Valancourt Books. Have you heard of them?
I know the name. I probably couldn't tell you anything from memory that they publish, but the name is in my head.
Well, basically what they do is they specialize in taking things that are out of print and putting them back into to print. So a lot of their catalog is like old books from like the 80s that you can't officially purchase in any way anymore, and they re-release them. So I got 2 books of theirs once I learned about that, because I thought it was pretty cool. One of them I got was the Valancourt Book of Horror Stories Volume 3, which was published in 2018. So obviously they have quite a few of these, and the stories in it are, some of them are out of print stories, but some of them are also just brand new stories that never got published for one reason or another, or might even be new. And I'm pretty early in the book, but I'm enjoying it a lot. I think the one I've enjoyed the most so far in it was one that was called Don't Go Up Them Stairs by Ronald Chetwynd Hayes, who I actually wasn't really familiar with this guy before I read this story, but I liked the story enough that I looked into it, and apparently he won a Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1988, and British Fantasy Society Special Award in 1989, which, for anyone that's not familiar, Bram Stoker Award, they just give out a bunch of different rewards every year to people that are contributing to the horror genre. And of course, the Lifetime Achievement Award is one that they will give to like 1 through 3 people each year. As an example, R.L. Stine got one in 2013, John Carpenter got one in 2007, and Stephen King got one in 2002. I think most of 2019's awards were announced in April, but so maybe a few months from now we can see what they're doing for the 2020 awards. But anyways, back onto that specific story, the Don't Go Up Them Stairs. What I liked about it was it kind of had that vibe of something like a Tales from the Dark Side episode, where it's short, sweet, just sort of sets up a situation where a boy has a very kind of odd, eccentric family, and he's not allowed to go in the attic, and basically just uncovers that his family is basically a coven of witches, and they have some sort of monster living up there that they have to feed their dead to keep it appeased. And the kid ends up getting too curious and poking his head around there, which gets it a bit upset and sort of changes up the dynamic they're having to deal with in the household. I don't want to get too in-depth in it since it's something recent if people want to read it, but I enjoyed it a lot. And mostly that the premise is a scary premise, but the way it's written and the way the dialogue has a lot of that camp that makes it feel like a Tales from the Dark Side episode. And the writer for it, that Ronald Chetwynd Hayes, after I looked into him a bit more, I discovered that actually a lot of his shorts have actually been used in anthology films before, like 1981's Monster Club, and or 1974's From Beyond the Grave by Amicus, who did like the 70s Tales from the Crypt film. So I guess the vibe I was picking up from the story seemed pretty spot on.
The Monster Club will always have a place for me because of John Bolton's Halls of Horror. I don't know if you remember those comics that we passed around occasionally. It's pretty much just a comic book version of the Monster Club.
I mean, I couldn't tell you which is which. Yeah, I've actually never seen the Monster Club. I know of it, but I guess it's something I need to dig into. I saw a bunch of people were in it that got my interest, like Vincent Price and Donald Pleasance.
Well, it's got that super famous meme gif, too, of the stripper that pulls off her skin to reveal a skeleton instead of a nude woman pulling off her clothes. He's actually a skeleton that pulls off her skin.
A skelly man. Okay, yeah, I've seen that. Okay, well, that's... Next week I'll probably be telling you I watched the Monster Club. I also went ahead and got another book of theirs called When Darkness Loves Us by Elizabeth Engstrom, just because I felt like I should support the publisher, in their main endeavor of getting out-of-print things back into publish. And that one was actually really surprisingly good. Its premise is basically that a woman is newlywed, and there's some tunnels, some like cave system underneath her property that they're going to be closing off soon because they don't want to leave it open when they have children. And so she decides to go explore it one last time before they seal it up. But while she's down there exploring, her husband seals it up, and so she ends up freaking out for a while, wandering around, and has a bit of a terror fit for a while because she thinks there's a monster in a lake down there, and then starts getting delirious from hunger and so on. And eventually, though, she makes it, and it sort of just turns into some sort of survival narrative that gets more and more uncomfortable as it goes on, where she's eating raw fish and cave slugs and discovers after a while that she's actually pregnant down there, and ends up successfully giving birth and then raising her kid in perpetual darkness. and then eventually she manages to get her way out of there and sees herself in a mirror and realizes what she looks like now, some sort of skeletal cave creature, and makes some efforts to reintegrate with society that don't go well, and then just starts kidnapping people and dragging them down there. So I enjoyed that one pretty good. It was a surprisingly short, though. The book, actually, that story only takes up about the first 80 pages of it. And actually, I think like the first 15 are a foreword by Grady Hendrix, the guy who wrote Paperbacks from Hell, if you're familiar with that. There's like another 140 or so extra pages after that are another story of hers that I haven't read yet. Yeah, it kind of gave me vibes of the Descent in the earlier parts of it.
I definitely have to look into that.
Have you been reading anything lately, or just watching things? Or
Recently picked up and finally read through Junji Ito's Smashed compilation.
Oh, I'm not.
It's manga, but I still consider it reading. I did finally order another copy of Hobgoblin because I don't actually have a physical copy of that book right now.
Then how will you know the stats on the cave giants? The Black Annis.
Smashed was a pretty good compilation. I didn't like it as much as I like Shivers and some of his other stuff I've read. There's a couple of stories that stand out in it. Earthbound is one. And as you know, his art style is very evocative and unique in the way he tells stories. You never really know what to expect. It can start off with one premise, but by the end, it's like drastically different. And in Earthbound, these people basically start locking up in place in these weird poses. Like some of them look like they're being crucified. Other ones look like they're hanging. And without giving too much away, as the story goes on, of course, it elaborates as to why this is happening and just the overall tone of the story. It does a very good job of building up before the exposition, and then once the exposition hits, you also get this nice little twist ending. So it was pretty nice. It was one of the standouts. The other one was a story called Roar. Where these two guys are walking in this little valley in this forest, and they see this flash flood happen. There's like people and houses and everything else in it, and it just goes off on a really wild tangent after that. It's not as crazy as anything like Gyo or Uzumaki, but it's definitely above the norm.
Okay, that one is also Junji Ito.
Yeah, so those were the two standouts in that one for me. Definitely preferred the Shiver compilation and some of his other stuff I've read, though.
Yeah, I saw that earlier this year there actually an art collection of his came out. I've been eyeballing it, wondering if I want to get that. Obviously, you've read way more Junji Ito than me. I feel like you've looked at everything of his, so I probably haven't looked at anything you haven't looked at. But
just last year they released a set of animated shorts that are based on some of his short stories, and there's some really nice stuff in there.
I know they did like I saw that. I was laughing so hard at the one. Is that the one that has like the segment where it has the film crew that are taking this famous actress out into the woods, and the famous actress just looks not human at all?
Yes.
And the film crew's just getting increasingly uncomfortable being around her as she like keeps unhinging her jaw to laugh, and they're just trying to pretend it's normal.
Yeah, she's actually a reoccurring character in a couple of his stories. That story's actually in the Shiver compilation, I believe. It's definitely a good one. That entire series is phenomenal, and they did an animated feature version of Gyo as well.
I was wondering if you'd seen that. I watched some like clips from it, and it looked like I don't know, it looked kind of iffy.
It's okay. They definitely took some liberties. Not nearly as many as you would think, but enough where it's different enough where I didn't see everything coming or have everything committed to memory. So it was very entertaining to watch.
Do you have any idea how it did?
Well enough, it got a localized release, which is, it's still hard to find a DVD version of the live-action Uzumaki film. Well, it was. It's just a lot easier to get a hold of now, but I remember at one time when I bought mine, I think I paid $30 for it.
I saw, for whatever reason, popping up in my YouTube recommendations a lot these days is clips from Kyochureto, or Island of Giant Insects, and I wondered if that was Gyo inspired, although it seemed like I did watch some of those clips, and it seemed like it was just a very generic big monsters here movie. It doesn't have all like the supernatural or psychological aspects that Gyo had.
Ito, too, is really big on body horror, and that's something that plays out a lot in Gyo. In the manga and in the film, there's plenty of portions that just make my skin crawl a little bit.
Yeah, I love some good body horror.
Yeah.
I haven't seen nearly enough Cronenberg, considering that. Anytime I start saying I like body horror stuff, people start asking me about Cronenberg's.
Well, I'm sure you get a lot of recommendations for Society as well.
Oh, I have seen Society. Very boring movie till you get to the last bit. And then the last bit's pretty amazing.
I'm a Yuzna fanboy.
Something else I'd seen. I finally decided to get around to watching one of the Paranormal Activity movies.
Yeah, I was curious as how that would play out for you.
I'd put it off a long time. I never even saw Blair Witch Project. Although Blair Witch is one of those, I feel like I've seen enough clips of it by now that I might as well have seen it. But I'm not usually into the found footage thing. I kind of tolerated it in Cloverfield, but I would have preferred it didn't have it.
So what did you think?
Well, it was better than I thought it would be. I guess I'll say that. I sort of just... I had this impression that it was just going to be very obvious how cheaply made it was, and that I was just going to see in every shot how they were just working around having to have any kind of practical effects or anything like that. And I guess I also just expected the acting to be bad. But no, the acting was perfectly fine, and I never had this moment where my suspension of disbelief was ruined by just seeing how obviously they were cutting around or working around something. And they did a surprisingly good job of keeping a good suspenseful tone going in it. And I also just thought the whole movie was just going to be flashing lights and doors opening and closing, and that'd be about it. But they actually did have a pretty steady ramp up of what the subtle things happening in the house were. And I did feel like it kind of fell apart at the ending. I know the movie had a different ending when it was originally in film festivals, and then they shot multiple endings and just went with one for the release version, but the ending just kind of felt like they got bored and stopped.
I agree with you about the acting and such, and it's by no means a horrible film, especially in the found footage genre that has a lot of forgettable films in it. But my main issue with the film is that the way it was marketed, it was a viral marketing campaign. It was this thrill-a-minute feature, and realistically, nothing happens the first half of the film. Nothing at all. I mean, hearing a noise outside and going to investigate isn't something happening. That happens to me, once or twice a month. And I never immediately think, oh, it's supernatural, and there's never a sense of malice behind it. But hearing something outside when you live in a public area doesn't really constitute a happening to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. That doesn't really translate to saying I enjoyed it, although I guess I would probably say I did. Not to the point where I feel like I'm so glad I saw this, or I'm so eager to watch part 2, but although I probably will watch more of them, because pretty much everybody that I've discussed the series with has told me that the first film is very much its own thing, which I mean is very obvious. From I know things like The Nun and Annabelle are tied in with it, so it seems like they just sort of get a little campier and out there as they go on, and probably as they get more budget. But
well, that's you're thinking of the Wannaverse, things. Annabelle, The Nun, that's all kind of tied in to the Warren series of films. Paranormal Activity, they actually build a pretty decent lore as the series goes on. In my opinion, the films get better as the series go on. A lot of people disagree.
Oh, wait, yeah, I think I misspoke. Yeah, The Nun, that's actually the Conjuring, right?
Yeah, that's the Conjuring verse. It's this...
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I was still... Okay, that makes me even more confused, because whenever people were talking about Paranormal Activity and they were saying it, first movie is very different from the way the series goes, I was just thinking of, yeah, of course, yeah, I've seen trailers for The Nun and Annabelle, but now that I remember that's Conjuring and not Paranormal Activity, now I'm not really sure what to expect, and I'm also upset because I just realized I have to watch 2 of these franchises.
Oh, I love the Wannaverse.
The Conjuring is found footage also, though, right?
No.
No, okay.
The 2 Conjuring movies, those are based on Ed and Lorraine Warren cases. continuously.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And then you have the Annabelle and the Nun movies that are thrown in there where they're working on a Crooked Man movie, another Conjuring film, The Devil Made Me Do It. And then the Paranormal Activity films, they are much more blatant, for lack of a better term, as the series goes on. They're much more, in my opinion, horror films, and they become drastically more in your face as the series goes on, but I think that works well, except in cases just like the 3D craze in the 80s. When you're doing found footage, you have to make all these weird justifications for why people are recording, 70% of their day.
Speaking of that kind of... Upon informing my roommates that I'd watched Paranormal Activity, they immediately started demanding that I watch Host, which is basically a sort of found footage film from this year. Actually came out July 30th. And so I believe the whole thing was shot in like 3 months or something like that. So it's very a COVID-19 related film. Like they're doing like the handshakes with the elbows and wearing face masks in it. Anyways, yeah, all throughout it, all this terrifying stuff is happening to these girls, and the whole time I'm just wondering why is it that almost any time they leave the room they take their laptop with them when they're terrified this bad?
I also hated how consequently no one ever, whenever someone was left alone in front of their laptop, conveniently everyone else had left the Zoom chat. So, earlier on when something creepy happens, there's no witnesses, even though there's initially, 6 people on the Zoom call, but anytime anything happens, there's only like one person on the call by themselves.
There actually are quite a few times in it, I noticed, where something does happen, none of them notice. And there's
acknowledge it.
a few. There's I mean, there's even like 1 or 2 times where like one of them says something and they like pick up their laptop and walk out of the room and they're chatting happily, and as they do, you just in the background see like somebody hanging from the ceiling for like 2 seconds.
Yeah.
And then I turned to like the people I was watching it with and was like, "Did you see that?" And they didn't see it either. So I will say I did enjoy Host a lot more than I did enjoy Paranormal Activity. I mean, obviously, it's years later, one was sort of like bringing found footage into the norm, and this is just the latest thing trying to do something new with it. Let's make it be a Zoom chat where you have like 6 screens you have to keep your eye on, so you never know which screen your eye should be watching for what's going to happen next. And
I enjoyed Host. I think the main issue I take with it, and this happens in a lot of found footage films, especially things like Host and the Unfriended films. When you get towards the end in these found footage films, they always become like full of calamity because these movies tend to be so much of a slow burn because of the premise and the way they're shot. When you get down to 1 or 2 cast members, that kind of slow burn doesn't work anymore because everyone knows some things happen. So they just you just get this cacophony of actions and sounds and scares all at one time in this movie you've been watching that is very suspenseful or has this very slow burn, just becomes this like eruption of chaos. And it doesn't make it a bad ending. In a lot of cases, I would prefer, they maintain that same like somber
I just
tone.
realized it kind of actually like doubles because you're kind of like watching a couple reaction videos at the same time you're watching the movie, because so much of it early on it's only focused on the ghost only seems to want to haunt one person at a time, so normally you're just watching a bunch of people reacting to the horror movie that you're watching in 1/6 of the screen. And they also I guess they kind of managed that by I can't remember exactly how it played out, but it was something like one person, the one guy, he cut out early in the call, so once everyone else already knew something was happening, he didn't. And then by the time he came back, only one girl was on the call, so she was trying to like warn him, but he like just thought she was trying to play a trick on him. And very clearly in the first few minutes of the of it, they like set up all the stuff they're going to do. Is like some person's like, "Look guys, a freaky puppet." I'm like, okay, the freaky puppet will be back later. And one girl's like, "Look guys, check out this chat filter I have that makes me look like a snake." Okay, we'll see that later. But
yeah,
but they didn't use it in the way I thought I did. They did have like just a face filter floating in a room, which was kind of whatever, but it wasn't that one. But instead they just had she turned on her like filter that makes like a snake tongue shoot out of her mouth every few seconds. but they didn't do anything scary with it. They just actually, while she's running through her house screaming and sobbing and terrified, the filter's still on. And I thought that was pretty funny. I liked that.
It reminded me very much of reading a creepypasta.
Oh yeah, the whole thing has a very creepypasta vibe to it.
But I enjoyed it. I'm not sad that I watched it. It might be a while before I watch it again, but I probably will.
I associate creepypastas with, or rather, I should say, I associate the whole phase of horror movies that are heavily revolved around social media, be it haunted VHS tapes or haunted Zoom chats or chain mails that make you get haunted. I associate all that with the creepypasta scene because I feel like that's a very modern brand of horror based around modern technology, and the creepypasta is a very, as we think of it now, is a very modern thing from the internet era.
Well, and that's a common trope in a lot of creepypastas as well. The laptop, the dark web chat, or the web chat goes wrong or something like that. That's a very common trope in a lot of creepypastas, and that doesn't make it a bad thing. It's just something that we've seen a variety of avenues of how it plays out.
Speaking of modern technology, when we were watching Paranormal Activity, it has the point where the TV turns on its own and they walk up there and the static's going. Me and all the people we were watching it with, we had to pause the movie and have a little debate about whether or not it was chronologically accurate for people to still have CRT TVs at that point in time.
Yeah, it was very early 2000s?
It was 2007.
Okay, so yeah, late 2000s.
Which I guess I got my first flat screen in 2007, yeah. But I think they've been around. I think I remember at the time I got it feeling like I was behind on getting one.
Well, let's see. I had a flat screen. It only supported 480p, but it was a CRT TV. It wasn't a flat panel TV, but it was a flat screen TV. And it actually wasn't a flat screen. It was just the way it was designed, and it was it supported 480 was the only HD resolution it supported. But I didn't have my actual first true flat screen TV till 2010 or 11.
It's just interesting to think because so many horror movies were using TV static trope. And I guess that's gone now.
Well, I mean, you can still have TV static. I have one of those indoor antennas just for news channels and stuff, and you can put it on a channel you don't have, and you'll still get static. But that's because of the broadcast. So
yeah, I feel like most younger people now wouldn't. I mean, they know what TV static is, but I don't think they'd know what that was.
Oh yeah. They would, TV static would be as foreign as rewinding a cassette tape with a number 2 pencil, or crumpling up paper and shoving it into the top of a VHS cassette or a music cassette tape to be able to record over it when it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah, probably just more computer horror on the horizon.
Yeah.
Well, that said, I did decide to look into who worked on that. Actually, I should have said earlier, Paranormal Activity, Blumhouse Productions film, directed, produced, and written by Oren Peli and starring Katie Featherston and Micah Sloat. I was surprised the guy used his real name, but then I got to host, and all the actors used their real names. Looking at the credits, it was Haley Bishop as Haley, Gemma Moore as Gemma, Emma Louise Webb as Emma, Radina Jandova as Radina. But that one was directed by Rob Savage and written by Gemma Hurley, Rob Savage, and Jed Shepard. And looking into it, apparently it was based off a short he made, a short that Rob Savage made just to sort of share with his friends and as a prank. And then I guess once with COVID-19 going on, he just decided to go ahead and make it be a full film. And of course, since everyone was separate when they recorded it, they had to actually give little mini courses to each of the actors so they could set up the practical effects in their own houses. I thought that was pretty interesting and cool.
Yeah,
and
definitely a lot more effort than you see in a lot of things we get.
Makes me wonder about the guy that set himself on fire. But I tried to look into what else he did. Paranormal Activity, it didn't look like the Paranormal Activity is the main thing they've done because that's been so consistent since then. Rob Savage, it looks like most of what he's done is indie film, mostly indie horror. I found some show I couldn't really understand the format of it called Fear House. It seems to be mostly operated out of Facebook, but they do shows at horror festivals, I guess. And apparently he did a short for them called Dawn of the Deaf, and he also there was a horror film mini festival thing called Bite Size Horror in 2018, where it was just 10 2-minute shorts, and he did one for that. So that seems to be the majority of the sort of things he's done. Shadow Original by Shadow House Films, and I tried to look into Shadow House, but they all their web pages seem to be under construction. Their Facebook's a bit underdeveloped, but from what I could gather, it seems like mostly what they do is short films for film shows. On that note, going back to Paranormal Activity for a second, were you familiar with Blumhouse Productions?
Oh yeah, I've them, A24, Ghost House Pictures. I enjoy most of what they do. They tend to take some of their films are more safe, but a lot of studios like that are taking more chances now, and I think it's a good thing because we're getting to see experimentation and getting to see these types of movies that we normally wouldn't get the chance to see. They're taking a lot of chances, and I think it's a good thing, especially in something like the horror genre, where, as it's happened many times over the decades, the genre is capable of getting very stale and for these little periods, and it's good we have these kind of film houses that are willing to take chances.
I agree with that, and I guess I only brought it up just because I kind of vaguely knew of Blumhouse as a studio that makes kind of these well, I guess they're probably mostly known for The Purge at this point, but I mostly just knew them as the people that make The Purge and Paranormal Activity and Insidious, so I kind of had a general horror vibe, but I discovered while looking into them that they're pretty all in on horror. Like they have like their own haunted house in California, I think, and they actually have a publishing house that publishes horror books.
Well, I really enjoyed Sinister. Sinister is one I really like, potentially one of my favorites from Blumhouse. Lords of Salem is one I enjoy a lot. I've never been really big into the Purge films.
Yeah, I've actually never seen any of them. I'd like to, but yeah, actually, I picked up one of their books. I haven't read it yet, but it's a New York Times bestseller apparently. But it's called Meddling Kids. It's published by Blumhouse Books, and it's basically like a Scooby-Doo riff. They never like explicitly say it, but it's got the cast is the same tropes, and they, as kids, uncovered this mystery and who the killer was, and got famous in newspapers. Then the book's sort of a set like years later when they discover maybe they didn't get it right and have to get the gang back together. So I've read a little bit of it, but not much. So I'm looking forward to that. Anyways, I guess that wraps up all I had to say about those. You have anything else you want to get into? I have a few more. But
well, as far as films go, on Last Drive-In, I recently watched Victor Crowley.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Same.
I know that's something you've looked into as well.
Probably a pretty different experience for me. I watched that as well, although I've never seen any of the other Hatchet movies, so...
I enjoy the Hatchet series for what it is. I think it's a great series. It tries to capture a type of movie that you don't really see anymore, and it's just the unapologetic slasher. They kind of built the same mythos like you had with Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. It reminds me a lot of a more cinematic version of kind of like Behind the Mask, the rise of Leslie Vernon.
I was told that the rest of the Hatchet series was pretty straight, but Victor Crowley was like, especially at the start, it was very comedy oriented.
With the kills, they always have fun with the kills in this series.
Well, not just with the kills. I mean, with like the tone, there's like jokes in most scenes.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like that first kill though, yeah, where he like chops off like all the girl's limbs, and she's just like, but her reaction isn't like, it's not a remotely visceral scene. It's like a scene out of Scary Movie, where I honestly, when he finished chopping off her limbs, I expected like something funny to happen. I thought they were going somewhere with this, but no, that was just the kill. But yeah, the tone was very much like Scary Movie, to the degree that like me and the people I was watching it with, we almost stopped watching it during like the first 15 minutes. But then it's odd because like the longer the film goes on, the more that falls away and the more it starts becoming a legit horror movie. But there's all these like vestigial pieces of when it was a comedy movie at the start left. So you have like 4 people in like trapped in a plane, and there's like a pregnant woman that just drowned in the water next to them, and you still got this guy that has to keep talking in his silly accent he had early in the movie.
Oh, he's definitely my favorite character. I enjoyed him
Mine too.
very much. The guy that shows up to be the as he puts it, the star of their film.
Yes, some real James Quall vibes from that guy.
I've also recently watched Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a documentary centered primarily around Mark Patton and A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, which you've always been a fan of that film. As I got older, I started to appreciate it a lot more amongst the Nightmare on Elm Street series.
I don't think I guess I always liked it, but I think it was still the same for me as everyone. That's what you said and what I've said and what my sister said and my roommates have said. Pretty much everybody I know has said is the first time they watched Nightmare on Elm Street 2, they didn't like it that much, but that each time they watch it, they like it more and more until it eventually starts to become a rival for their favorite for them.
The documentary itself is really well, and I've seen a lot of the stuff that happened in this documentary that it goes over. I've seen a lot of it before, and like the documentary Never Sleep Again. That's a really in-depth documentary on the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It's similar to His Name Was Jason or Crystal Lake Memories.
Oh.
You know, those were two franchise-wide documentaries about Friday the 13th, obviously.
Oh yeah, and real quick, before we go too far, I should probably cut in. I'm sure we'll get better about this with time, but yeah, Victor Crowley, I should have said 2017 comedy slasher by Aries Scope Pictures, distributed by Dark Sky, written directed by Adam Green, produced by Will Barrett, Sarah Albert, and Corey Neal.
Okay, and well, like with Scream Queen, I think it does a very good job of kind of, as Mark tells his story of how initially, he was an actor, doing a film. It was going to be his breakout, and then it became this kind of like burden for him. Then it was his cross to bear, and he's kind of finally reached this point where he accepts it for what it is. And the resolution's really nice for it. He finally gets, tell his full story about how he felt the whole time, and it's kind of nice because it shows how enduring the legacy of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is. And it was released April 5th, 2019. It was directed by Tyler Jensen and Roman Chimienti. I hope I've got that right.
Do your best.
It was produced by Mark Patton, Roman Chimienti, and Jeff Harden. You get to hear some insight from a lot of people in the film, of course, but you also get to see some people that, like Heather Langenkamp. Like, she wasn't actually in that film, but she gets, she says her piece about the film. Other than that, gaming-wise, actually, D&D group I played with, we've actually just started the newer Curse of Strahd campaign. I'm kind of excited about that because very early on in my introduction to Dungeons & Dragons, we had a friend who was very much into the whole Ravenloft aspect. I remember he had the Von Richten's guides, and D&D was actually how I found out about Vlad the Impaler. Vlad Tepes Dracul, and the basis of Dracula off of Vlad the Impaler and all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking forward to progressing through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I ain't got too much on the gaming front. I have been I've got Evil Within 2 been fixing to start on. I kept trying to hold off till I finished Evil Within 1, but I kept having issues where I was losing my save file. At this point, Evil Within 2 is old enough. I'm just going to have to give up on that dream and just start on Evil Within 2. But I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I'm about 3/4 of the way through Daymare 1998. It's a pretty fun game, especially if you kind of grew up.
I think I've heard of that one.
Playing the PS1 era survival horror games like the original Silent Hill, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, Dino Crisis.
Have you finished that one?
No, I'm about 3/4 of the way through. It's challenge-wise, it's a little bit. It's kind of a throwback in the challenge department too. It's very much meant as a love note. I believe it started off actually as a fan-made Resident Evil 2 project, and then when Capcom announced their Resident Evil 2 remake, they went along and developed their own IP. I actually pre-ordered it and bought it a while back, but I bought it on console, and when it initially launched, there were a lot of issues, so I waited a couple of patches till I noticed people talking about those issues being alleviated, and I started playing it, and it was like the first time I played Resident Evil 2. In a day and a half, I played through 3/4 of the game. I could not put it down. I died a few times. And aside from the absence of tank controls, it's almost to me just like playing Resident Evil 2 on a PlayStation or N64 back in the day. As you know, unfortunately, my initial Resident Evil 2 playthrough was on an N64, which is okay because I got to have green or purple blood.
If that's something you're looking for, I suppose. It's kind of funny, I really didn't expect you to mention Daymare 1998. I only recently heard of that and just happened to watch a video of somebody doing some analysis of it, so I'll be curious to hear your thoughts when you're done with it. Although that does kind of remind me, are you familiar with the Haunted PS1 Demo Disc 2020?
No, I'm not.
Okay, it's similar vein, where it's kind of trying to be like a throwback. Haunted PS1 Demo Disc 2020. They even made a commercial for it. You can watch it online, where it's trying to just present itself like a Halloween demo disc for the PS1 that came out, and just has a bunch of demos of games. And so, they're all trying to capture that same PS1 aesthetic, and they all go about it in different ways, and it's pretty cool. There's actually I know after it finished, they actually did like a spiritual successor that is basically doing the same thing. It's just an anthology of indie games, although the successor one doesn't necessarily require that you stick with the PS1 vibe, although a lot of them still do. And some of them do other stuff, there's one where it's like a Tiger Electronics LCD game, but it's a horror game. So I've been looking into those a lot. I think that stuff's really cool.
Oh yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out.
Yeah, I'll get some links to you later.
For me, anyways, that about wraps up recent horror stuff I've kind of been into last week or two. I'm looking forward to some things coming up soon, but that's for another episode after I've experienced them.
Oh, is it? Alright, so this episode's running a little long, so this is where we'd normally have our news section, which is probably going to end up mostly just being us discussing upcoming things we're looking forward to or have just heard about. But I will try to run through it pretty quick this time around. That said, I guess I'll just open with, I know you and I, while this is our horror podcast we're doing, we have plenty of other shared interests. We've gone and seen most of the Marvel movies, so I assume you've been keeping an eye on the New Mutants as much as I have.
Yes, and it seems like tonally, initially when they were starting to show stuff from it and talking about it, it seemed like it was going to have a very horror tone to it. And the newest trailer they've released seems like that's mostly been discarded. Especially the last, the trailer before this when they released, felt like a horror movie trailer.
I hope that's not the case. I know, obviously this movie's kind of almost ended up in development hell for a while. It's like, there's a lot of, if you ever go on any of the trailers for it online, there's a bunch of jokes about how, because they showed a trailer and then it disappeared for a few months, and then they started having trailers again, and then COVID-19 happened, so it disappeared, and now they start having trailers again for it a third time. But I know Josh Boone, who did the screenplay with Nate Lee and is the director, he specifically said he was going for a horror movie vibe, and he specifically cited Nightmare on Elm Street, which is obvious in the trailer. It has like that scene with the hands pressing through the wall. I know he said that if he wants it to be a trilogy if it can be, and if so, he wants each film to be a different genre of horror movie.
I could see that working. I mean, there's definitely enough material in the Marvel universe to make that work.
Yeah, he said this one's like the rubber reality supernatural horror, and then the second film would be an alien invasion film featuring Warlock, and then the third film would be an apocalyptic horror based around Inferno.
It would be so hard to take any movie with Warlock in it seriously.
Yeah. That all sounds pretty pie in the sky. I just hope I don't have a lot of hope that would happen, though I'd love it, but I just hope this one feels like a Nightmare on Elm Street old school film like he claimed he was trying to do.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But anyways, yeah, that'll be out giving out when we're recording, but that'll be out in a few days, but who knows when I'll get to see it with everything going on right now. Aside from that, something else I'm looking forward to is September 10th, The Babysitter Killer Queen's coming out on Netflix. Did you see the original The Babysitter?
I've watched bits and pieces of it. I've never actually sat down and finished it.
You would like it. I loved that movie. That was fantastic. That movie had a really 80s vibe. It had and even instead of it was a really funny movie, but it was also scary, and it also even got emotional near the end. So I really loved The Babysitter. It's my style of humor.
When the initial time I started to watch it, I had just come off of watching The House of the Devil, and so I was tonally in a completely different place, and it kind of let me set up false expectations for what I was expecting going in. So I didn't finish it then, and I've started it since then, but I started it with my wife, and we haven't both been able to sit down and finish it yet.
I think I made a faux pas because I was hanging out at some people from work's house, and they told me to put on whatever, and I picked that. they sat through it, but they seemed to think I was weird for picking that. Anything you wanted to mention? I got a little bit more, but
something that recently has come up, which I'm unsure how to feel about. Morgan Creek has announced that they're working on a reboot of The Exorcist, and there's apparently now a petition on change.org to stop the reboot from happening. You know me, I have opinion on reboots that it probably not shared by a lot of people. I would rather a reboot happen than for an IP to just stagnate, simply because no matter how good a film is, how impactful it is, Citizen Kane, for example, that movie's been heralded as one of the greatest movies ever made, but this much time has passed, very few people, in our generation have seen that film. The generation after us, even fewer people, regardless of the fact that it's a great movie, that it's such a heralded movie, less and less people are going to see it with each generation. I would much rather an IP be rebooted and fail than to never take a chance at doing something with that IP.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a modern remake of Exorcist being good, but I acknowledge it. It could happen, so I'll withhold my judgment. I know they're also doing a Candyman remake that's coming out in October.
I'm actually really excited for that, because with the series as it was, there's no logical point to make another film in that series, but I also believe that there, aside from the absolutely iconic portrayal of Candyman by Tony Todd, it's such a free-form myth or story, especially when you take the source material of Clive Barker's story out of the equation. There's so much mythos there, there's so much possibility there, that I could see a reboot being amazing for that film, and I'm actually really excited for it.
Definitely be keeping an eye on that one. I also, something else I actually only recently became aware of was, I know, Halloween kind of ran through that series where they did the original series till it jumped the shark, so then they rebooted with the Rob Zombie ones, but I guess those didn't resonate too well, so then they did the sort of, I don't really want to call it a soft reboot, I'm not sure what it is, an alternate canon reboot where they...
Yeah, it's one of the deals where they just ignore all the other sequels.
Yeah, and I assumed that was going to be a one-off just because, the actors are kind of up there in the years and that they would try to do something else, but I only recently saw that apparently they're doing that's going to be a trilogy.
They did a similar thing with Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
They're doing a Halloween Kills in 2021 and Halloween Ends in 2022, running off that same alternate canon that they've set up with the 2018 Halloween film.
I really enjoyed Halloween 2018. I thought it was a really good follow-up to the first film. But I also love pretty much all the Halloween films, except for Resurrection.
Yeah, I'm probably not nearly as into that franchise as you. I think it's about 1 and 2 are it for me. And, 3 has its charms, but...
Supernatural has resumed taping.
The TV series?
Yes, they have 7 episodes. They have 7
No,
episodes
they're never going
left.
to end. They're going to red dwarf it and just keep coming back.
Oh no, this is actually the series finale. I mean, they've said that before, but I think initially season 4 or 5 was supposed to be the original ending point, and then they went on for another season, and then people left the show, and then it kept going and kept going. I have a soft spot for this series. I saw the first episode when it initially premiered. I've stuck with it for all these years. I kind of get why it's time to end the series. There's really no logical place for them to go anymore.
I only watched the first season or 2 and a few scattered episodes, but hearing people go over the synopsis is kind of funny. Hearing one of them went to hell, then they came back, and now the other one went to hell, and now they came back, and now one of them's a demon.
Well, me and you actually watched the majority of the first episode, or the first season, together over the internet. Back years and years ago, before we had Discord or anything. I think we sat on Yahoo Messenger, maybe?
I hope not, but it's possible.
We just sat there watching episode by episode, doing commentary with each other.
Something else I just, as I was prepping for this episode with you, I discovered that apparently just a few days ago it was announced that they're making a Fear Street movie on Netflix, and it's actually going to be 3 movies. Apparently they've already finished filming them all, and the plan is just to release 1 each month for 3 months in a row next year. They didn't really have any details on them, so I don't know if it's based off any specific Fear Street arc or anything. All I really know is it's directed by Leigh Janiak, who I'm not familiar with her. Apparently she's directed 2 episodes of the Scream TV series and the 2014 sci-fi horror film Honeymoon. I suspect Honeymoon, it wasn't much like the Fear Street movies are going to be.
Hopefully it's the cheerleader saga.
Well, we'll see. I'm hoping for Cataluna.
Of course you are. Or, what was the vampire's name that he was a reoccurring character for a couple of books? I can't remember.
I don't know. There was that trilogy series you and I had with the wax cover where it was basically just somebody staying immortal using a...
that was the history. It basically was the history of why Fear Street was the way it was. It was about the family that initially started all the crazy shit that happened on Fear Street.
I doubt it'll be about that, but it'll probably be a lot more high school oriented.
And we'll have the modernization, of course. So it can only be so many because a cell phone would disrupt the plot of so many of those books.
It's fine. You just do a lot of things do, and you just start every significant scene by having somebody accidentally drop their phone.
The only other really recent thing is that I have Junji Ito has a localization that's being released in December. I went ahead and pre-ordered it. It's called Ramina, and I'll just read the little short synopsis for it. An unknown planet emerges from inside a wormhole, and its discoverer, Dr. Ogoro, christens the celestial body Ramina after his own daughter. His finding is met with great fanfare, and Ramina herself rises to fame. However, the planet picks up speed as it moves along in its curious orbit, eliminating planets and stars one after another until finally Earth itself faces extinction. Is the girl Ramina the true cause of the catastrophe? A masterwork of horror from Junji Ito unfolding on a universal scale. Now, I will say, in general, if I read a synopsis like that on, something I wasn't exposed to or anything, I would probably assume one trope after another, but after being a fan of Ito for so long, I can almost guarantee you nothing in it is going to happen like I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of funny. I feel like I'm the opposite, where I heard that synopsis and I thought that sounded pretty good to me if it was anyone else, but since it's Junji Ito, I know it'll be good regardless, but since it's Junji Ito, I assume that most of what I'll end up experiencing in it isn't going to be related to that synopsis much at all.
Yes, and it will be completely unexpected. I think a lot of where I was coming from with that, though, is because that's another very common creepypasta trope, and I've been deep into creepypasta podcasts lately, and that's another very common trope in a lot of creepypastas is somebody discovers a celestial body or a star or a planet that either no one else can see or has never been discovered before, and as they look at it or as it gets examined more and more, crazy stuff starts happening. Junji Ito actually has a story where a constellation is discovered and it basically affects people in really weird ways. It's one of his better ones, in my opinion.
Thank you for listening to Here is the Horror. Subscribe and review Here is the Horror wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also help make the world a little more horrifying by subscribing to us on Patreon, where you can gain access to bonus content and directly support the podcast.
You can also follow us at Here is the Horror on Twitter and Instagram, and join or like us on Facebook at facebook.com Here is the Horror for additional content and to help support us.
You can also find us at here'sthehorror.com, where you can find all of our episodes, show notes, and more. You can email any questions, comments, or suggestions to us at here'sthehorror@gmail.com.
And thank you for listening. It means everything to us.
The opening song is Nightmare Machine by Kevin MacLeod. The interstitial songs are Supernatural Radio by Kevin MacLeod, The Visitor by Shane Ivers, and Engulfed by the Night by Darren Curtis. The closing song is Dealing with the Devil by Darren Curtis. Join us next time, where we'll be discussing the early development of horror in Episode 2, A History of Horror.
Stay horrified, guys. Is that a cut?
Yes, that's a cut. Maybe we'll get to work on a horror movie of ourselves someday.
That's the dream. Shit, we're gonna have to do another take on this. I can't think of the word I want to use.